Hey everyone, coming up is Jerry Felice's interview with Echobatics founder Gary Bartos. Thank you so much.
Hello, Jerry here again. I am really excited about our guest today. He is president and founder of Echobatics. He has years and years of experience in the technology space. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you. Hi.
So, little background here. Tell me about yourself, how you got into this space, what motivated you to do it.
Sure. So briefly, there are two main elements here. One is, so as we'll get into, I developed an app, or where companies developing an app for the iPhone initially, and it uses the camera. And I've worked in camera-based technology for over 20 years, image processing, machine vision, computer vision. Initially for industrial automation, and there was a lot of cool tech there, and I realized not all of that was making it into apps. And I was kind of surprised. I said, well, it looks like there's a use for that. So there's my experience as an engineer inventor. And the second part is I have a mild visual impairment myself. So I'll lean into the camera. Like many people who are visually impaired, I have strabismus. My eyes aren't aligned. So, I see the world differently. I'm stereo blind. The world is kind of more 2D for me than it is for typically sighted people. So growing up, I looked different. I see the world differently. I happen to grow up in a town in Michigan that has the second oldest leader dog school. There are all these things that just sort of came together. So it's a combination of experience as an engineer and also wanting to, I guess, make my work more personal, and that, what could I do that's going to be more meaningful? And I thought, well, here's some experience. I have a taste of this experience, and starting to make friends who were blind, I realized, hey, this would be a good place to develop something. And I saw that there were gaps in the technology that was out there.
So, what gaps did you see? And along those lines,
Yeah.
what problem did you feel like needed to be solved?
So the gaps that I saw had a lot to do with what I'll call the built world. The world is built, it's engineered primarily for sighted hearing people. So everything from the way buildings are laid out, they assume people are fully sighted. Sometimes stairwells. But to be more specific, especially when I asked around, and we went through a long period of just asking, what are you having problems with? Do you want to do this? Asking about things related to, we started focusing on things indoors. And I realized one thing, and it was obvious once we started talking to people about it, was that touchscreens, all of these touchscreens are, kiosks, restaurant menus, they're getting to be more and more. They're, to use a scientific term, there are gazillions of these things out there, and the number increases every year. It's easy to develop for touchscreens, and it's especially easy if you're developing only for sighted people and you ignore everyone else. And I realized, wow, there are a whole bunch of people out there who can't use these devices that are now basically being pushed on us all, and that's actually making the world less accessible. So there's more technology, but it's becoming less accessible. And I thought, oh, that's a huge problem. And it's not just for one group of people with visual impairments. It basically affects everybody. It also affects people with dyslexia and so on. So after considering different apps and trying different prototypes, this is what we settled on. We realized, wow, this is something that's important, is we can use technology to, in effect, help a lot of people interact with existing technology, to not wait years and years for someone to create accessible kiosks, but say, we're going to make what's out there accessible, just like Apple did with the iPhone, but we're doing this to other devices. You bring the accessibility to them. So there's a lot of conversations and surveys and interviews and thinking led to that.
So, you sent me the test flight link the other day, and I was able to download it.
Yeah.
and I'm on iOS 16 now. So I think you were telling me earlier that the hand recognition is a little bit more improved. You're working out some of the bugs, but I was really just impressed with the possibility. So what I ended up doing last night was testing it out on my TV, and just pointing at different objects, like whether I was on Netflix or trying to like identify movies. And you could just see the endless possibilities for how you're using the OCR, how you're using the app. I think one of the things I really appreciate about the design of this is that the innovation really allows for endless possibilities of application. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So one thing that's important is we think of this as a tool. And we want that tool to become natural to use. We want it to basically get out of your way. So you learn to use it. There is definitely, it's a new tool. It's like using a cane or a dog or some other app on your phone. It takes a little while to get used to. Once you're used to it, we want it to be natural. So in order for it to be natural, there are a couple things we need to do. One of which is it has to have a minimal amount of feedback that has to be consistent. So right now, you hold your phone in your left hand close to your body. The camera is pointed outward towards whatever it is you want to read. And then when you move your other hand out, so I'm holding my hand up and my finger's quite close to the camera, sort of illustrating that your other hand is pointing at what you want to read. So that's why it's called point and speak. So the idea is that we're essentially following the model of what sighted people do because things are designed for them to use things this way. Like, oh, I see this word on a button. I'm going to reach out to it, press that button because it has that word on it. That's what we're making possible in the absolute simplest way that we can imagine for the user. Now, the technology underneath, that can get really complicated. But the idea is that it's as natural as any other tool. Once it's in your hand, once you're using it, you start to get used to it. You start to see other uses for it. And it could be that once we have this basis, we say, hey, it's working well for a variety of devices. Using it for Netflix hadn't even occurred to me. But as part of our plans, one thing is, hey, can we recognize a device? And there are different ways to do that. Once we recognize a device, then we can offer a little bit more specialized guidance. But it's no different from, say, having someone right next to you, say it's a sighted person, saying, oh, okay, here are the buttons. What is it you want to do? You could ignore most of the buttons. Here are the interesting ones. Or tell me what you want to do. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but tell me what it is you want to do, and I'm going to guide you button to button to do that. So that's where we're headed. Long term, it's the intelligence of the app providing minimal feedback. So you, the user, the tool user, really are the one doing the work. We're still relying on the person's brain doing the most of the work. We're just giving them one more tool as part of their set of tools. So that's our thinking. That means we think we have a good minimalist approach to making kiosks accessible with multiple screens, making household devices accessible, restaurant menus accessible. It's the same kind of feedback all the time, but we gradually accommodate ways of interpreting what's out there, what sort of guidance someone would look for. You can think of it as, and I'm going to be really grandiose in saying that, but this is our goal, is imagine you had a combination O&M instructor and a TVI blended together in your phone for this one task, making flat touch screens with buttons, control panels accessible. It's like, oh, move your finger left. Oh, the button you want is up to the right, or just announcing things. And there's so many of these devices that there's so many ways this can be used over time.
Yeah, I really appreciate the innovation of these devices. There's been a lack of innovation in the space for some time. It's been getting better though, which is it's nice to see different people getting into the space. Obviously the iPhone has helped a lot with that. It gives you the hardware you need and the software you need to develop the tools. So specific to we had talked in the past about serving a particular demographic of folks. You could see multiple applications for it, completing specific tasks, and I could totally see how it could benefit a much larger audience. But you wanted to specifically serve the deaf blind community. Do you
Yeah,
want to touch on that a little bit?
yeah, that's really important to us. So the app is meant to work for all blind and visually impaired people. And quite often when people talk about technology for blind and visually impaired, they essentially forget that in that group you have the deaf blind, or we can think of people with some degree of significant hearing loss, some degree of significant vision impairment. So when I looked at the field and I saw, hey, there's a gap, for instance, with um, assistive technology for interacting with devices, and I say, wow, especially for people who are deafblind. It always seemed there was much less technology, which is strange that if someone has two sensory impairments, you'd think there would be more technology so they can do the same things as everyone else. No, there's less, at least from what I've seen. And it was also even more expensive in some cases. So I made it a principle of the company that if we're going to develop something, it has to be accessible to the deafblind. If it's not accessible to the deafblind, it's not really accessible. We're not providing accessibility to them, and we're also not meeting our goal of what I call tech equity. That is, everybody should be able to use this tech that's out in the world. We didn't all build it together. We're building it for each other. Everyone should be able to use it, and they should be able to use it with the same ease. They should be able to accomplish things in the same amount of time, and they should have the same outcomes, not be restricted to just some, few types of things. And I thought, well, if we focus on the deafblind in particular, then we say, okay, we've really got to make sure we have an input mode. Like if they're going to ask, for instance, I want to get a iced latte, something I got this morning. And they're going to use our app, our technology, to order from a touchscreen menu independently. How would that work? So when we answer those questions, then we end up answering questions for a lot of people. If we can make something accessible for people who are deafblind, we're going to make it accessible for the largest possible group of people. And that's really important, is reaching as many people as possible, because to me, that's what's equitable. It's what it means. We want to make sure everyone can use this technology, and it just becomes sort of second nature. It's like, oh, hey, here's one of these screens. Here's this device that has a touchpad. I'm going to pull out my phone. I'm going to use my app. And then maybe if someone's deafblind, it's like, oh, and I'm going to use my refreshable braille display, or maybe some other tech we're working on, both to give commands to the app and to get feedback. So I know what it is I'm pointing at, and I know how to use the device in front of me. So to summarize, if we make our app work for the deafblind, we're making it work for a really large group of people. And we're including a group that's often overlooked.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I was really impressed about the approach, because I had the pleasure of serving the deafblind community when I was training at Perkins.
Mm-hmm.
Actually worked for the I Can Connect program.
Oh, yeah.
And so really rewarding program. But you'd go into people's homes and you see the challenges, and to see a company really focused on serving that population, it's very encouraging, because there's a real need there.
Yeah.
There's a real need for innovation. I remember when I was working with a client, and the client basically had ushers.
Yep.
And so that's, you're losing your hearing, you're losing your vision. So one of the things I learned from that experience was, one, when I came in,
Mm-hmm.
I liked that minimalist approach, because I looked at her desk, 27 different magnifiers, whatever. There's just a ton of stuff, because the visually impaired have a tendency to kind of take a magnifier instead of using zoom,
Yeah.
just to kind of read stuff, just because it's easier to do.
Right.
Or at least they perceive it to be easier, even though functionally it's not really. And so had to teach her how to change the contrast, got her a Bluetooth keyboard. She ended up typing with the Bluetooth keyboard, or she had her doctors type with the Bluetooth keyboard so she could visually read it.
Right.
Text got customized and everything like that. But it was a very personalized solution, and that's sort of what I'm getting at. The template that you've developed and are working on, it's malleable enough to have a lot of customizable application, I think. And so that's what excites me about any kind of good technology. That's why I was like a big fan of when the Sunu band came out.
Yep.
The design was really good. It's just, and it's no disrespect to any of the things that have come before, right? Like the CCTV, amazing invention. It was
Yeah.
a pioneer when it came out. But you need something more portable. You need something that you can have in your hands. You need something that's you can apply to many things, not have it limited. And so that's sort of the beauty of guys like you getting into this space and
Mhm.
contributing your principles and your ideas. There's a real need for that. You had mentioned principles, like can you
Yeah.
kind of talk about some of the key pillars
Yes.
regarding for your organization?
So our one key principle is very simple, and this applies to what happens inside the company and what happens outside the company. 2 words: people first. We're not developing tech because tech is cool. I mean, yes, when you're younger, some of it's like, oh, this is great. Look at all these things I can do. Okay. There is a real need for people to use tech, again, as tools. Developing tech is not the end goal. It's just a way that I see to achieve, and this is really the second principle, tech equity. How do we make sure that a deafblind person can go and, for instance, they're going to an airport and they want to check in their baggage and they want to do this independently? How do we make that happen? The important thing to me is not, ooh, they're using our app. No, the important thing is they can get that done. So we want to make sure that everybody, and we're focused on the blind and visually impaired community, everyone can achieve what they want to do with technology, what technology they have themselves and technology they use out in public. And there's a lot of technology out in the public now. And by technology, I'm referring mostly to digital technology, but there are other things we're interested in as long as it stays within our company's focus, where, anything in the built world is technology. And I'm not saying we're going to do this, but I want to give an example of something that's maybe simple, but let's say if someone is walking around and they get lost. Anyone who's ever been in a hospital has experienced this, I think. It doesn't matter if you're sighted or blind. If you're in a hospital, you're going to get lost. That's just the way it is. And imagine that you could just see the arrow signs pointing left, pointing right, like X-ray this way. You need to find things like that. And again, I'm not saying that's necessarily a thing we're going to work on, but there are these things that is, believe it or not, that's a kind of technology. It's just a sign, but it's a sign that's inaccessible to a lot of people. So when we focus on tech equity, that means we're emphasizing independence. You don't have to ask a sighted person for guidance. You don't have to call ahead. And it's that thing that I find really fun to think about, is not having to plan as much, being more spontaneous. So when I talk to team members who are blind, one of the things they've brought up, and we've started talking about more again recently, is how much planning, and let's think of it as extra planning, they need to do to take a trip. They want to go from here to there, especially if it's somewhere new. It's like, where's the door? How do I get in there? If I'm going to go to a specific room, how do I walk to get there? Do I need, for example, if I'm going to go there regularly, do I need to work with an O&M instructor to find my way through the building and really learn the layout? This is a lot of extra planning that sighted people do not have to do. And that tends to clamp down on spontaneity, which is my point. Tech equity doesn't just mean we're doing these workaday things, which are important, and they are the basis, like using technology, using touch screens, being able to navigate through the world. But we also want to support things like spontaneity. Technology that exists today really reinforces spontaneity. Hey, do you want this kind of drink instead of that one? Do you want to go to this place instead of that one? All these spontaneous choices. And it's typically harder with these inaccessible devices for someone who's blind, visually impaired, to be that spontaneous. So by thinking of people first, we always think, how are we actually serving the community? And by making sure development focuses on tech equity, people can achieve the same things in the same amount of time with the same ease, then we're, again, going back to people first, we're focusing on one, independence, and two, just getting things done, and three, really, it's supporting spontaneity, moving around in the world, doing the same things in the same way, intermixed with sighted people for whom, let's admit it, a lot of these things were designed.
So Gary, how did you get the name Echobatics?
So a few of us were trying to come up with names that represented both what we were working on or were planning to work on, and that, you know, as the founder, sort of fitted my personality. So it was easy for me to say, easy for me to think of, and also was associated with our very, very, very long-term pie in the sky goals. And this is not something I've actually said sort of publicly before. So I appreciate the opportunity to do this. So one, I really like bats, one of my favorite animals. And it's not because bats and blind people have been associated in the past. That happens to be a coincidence. I don't know if anyone's going to believe me. And I could go on and on about this, as could my friend Lindsay Azzolino, who's also a huge fan of bats. She's also one of my advisors. And it's just that I like bats. Bats, especially microbats that use ultrasonic chirps to find their snacks at night when they're flying around, they're experiencing the same world we are, but they're using a sense that we as humans don't have. And I really like this idea because it ties very closely with another goal of the company, which is not to try to give sight to people who are blind and visually impaired. You notice there's nothing related to sight in the company's name, or seeing, or light, or anything like that. It's to accentuate and build on the senses and skills that people have, right? So to me, that meant, well, what if effectively we could turn people, and some people, I'm already gonna say this, is you might be turned off by this, you don't have to think of it this way. What if effectively we could turn people into bats? And I don't mean using ultrasound, like using the Sunu band or something, using ultrasound. That's one of the things that we thought about using when we were considering what we're going to develop. But it's just the idea that, what if we can develop something that works essentially as an extra sense, or as a different sense? So we're not trying to replace a sense, we're adding one. And that is a long-term guidance. So bats use echoes to find things. We're interested in finding, interacting with things. We're not trying to, guide people to mosquitoes to eat them. No judgment if that's what you want to do. But so echoes, bats use this additional sense, echolocation. Bat, literally from the animal, and IX because that's just one of the things you tack on the end of a company name, especially if you started working in the mid-90s. So Echobatics, and it doesn't necessarily mean these things. It was just a bunch of little words that we kind of jammed together out of a very, very long list that we considered. But it does have another element that I'll mention, is one of the long-term goals has been to incorporate a lot of different technology seamlessly. So we're developing touchscreen technology, but this is adjacent to apps that other people are developing. Paul Ruvolo and his group developing Clue, for example, indoor navigation. As I mentioned, and I haven't talked to Paul, I think, too much specifically about this. What if Clue could take you to an interface and you say, oh, hey, now you can use point and speak from Echobatics to interact with that interface. When you're done, you can use Clue again. So the idea of using apps together gets us to the point where we say, hey, what if we could use 2 or 3 or 4 apps perhaps developed by different groups, each focusing on their own specialty, then a lot of interesting things become possible. It may be this is necessary. This is one of the reasons I believe, for instance, indoor navigation has been such a tough problem to solve is, one, people are thinking of it in the way that sighted people think of navigation. And two is that you really need a lot of specialist groups, each developing a piece of a solution. And then you've got to find a way to bring them together. And so to get back to the point of the company name, Echobatics is what I imagined early on. And I don't remember if this came first or I just realized it, coincidentally, things worked out nicely, is I imagined a totally blind gymnast on parallel bars, for example, jumping up, knowing they were there, grabbing onto them, doing a routine, flipping off, landing, holding her arms up, walking off stage, and no one knows she's blind. And that's way out there. That is a very odd, I don't normally talk about this because it sounds borderline impossible, but this is the sort of thing I'm imagining. Imagine if being blind just meant, oh, you need a few additional tools. For instance, you and I are both wearing what I call assistive technology, glasses. This is assistive technology. And what if assistive technology for people who are blind and visually impaired essentially became that invisible to them and that invisible socially, to the point where you would have blind and visually impaired people doing things that right now people say, oh, that's impossible. That's not even conceivable. Well, it was inconceivable that blind and visually impaired people would drive cars. There's work on autonomous vehicles. I'm thinking of things as being much more, I guess you'd say, personal. Is like, can I do things with my body? Can I do things with devices out there in the world that right now are accessible to me? Could I do that with something like Echobatics technology? Could I be an acrobat? Could I, for example, that was actually my best example.
That was
basically, like, can I move about the world doing the same things that a sighted person can do? And then I think over time, technology out there will become more accessible so that we don't have to fill in these gaps quite so much. But I think it's going to become accessible in part by getting people out there, and then others, maybe engineers and developers and salespeople, saying, hey, why are you using that with our system? It's like, well, your system isn't accessible, so I need this additional piece of tech. Maybe you could work together with this company. I would love to actually, for this app one day to not be necessary, honestly. But we need to fill in this gap in the meantime. We need to get there first, make the things accessible, and then it's a lot easier for people to go back to the manufacturers and say, hey, this is possible. You can make this accessible, and you should. And here's someone who's already done it. Maybe now you can build this into your device.
Yeah, that imagery of the gymnast, it really does resonate with the human spirit, man. I really like that example quite a bit because it doesn't. You're breaking limitations and boundaries, and that's really beautiful.
For more information, please contact Echobatics at Echobatics on Twitter, Echobatix on Twitter. Please go to their Facebook, www.echobatics.facebook.com, for their Facebook page. We'd like to thank Gary Bartos and Echobatics for being a part of today's episode. For more information, please contact Jerry Feliz, Access Technology Director, phone number 857-443-6636, email jfeliz@mapcommunity.org. Thank you so much.